So hey everyone, in this video we want to implement user authorization into our backend project. Okay, so there is a difference between user authentication and authorization. Okay, authentication is something related to the JWT stuff. Basically the user has to send in the token validating from the backend, and if the token is invalid, then the backend restricts the user from accessing any routes. So that is all about authentication. Okay, and this is something called as authorization. Even though the user is logged in, so the user will be restricted to access certain routes, okay, based on the role. So a role might be, for example, the role is an admin, or the role might be an user, okay, a normal user, or the role might be an admin. So basically, for example, the user should not be able to get all the to-dos. So well, in this particular case, any user can be able to get all the to-dos as long as the user is authenticated, which we already implemented in the last video. Okay, however, in this video we just want to set up authorization and assign certain roles to each user. Like for example, a user has a role of admin, or the user has a role of just a normal user. Okay, so let's say we would just want to restrict this particular route to only admins. Okay, so no other user will be able to access this route except admins. Okay, so that is what we will be doing in this video. So let's get started. Hey guys, it's me from the future. I just realized we don't need to pass in the access token through authorization header. Since it is already stored in cookies, we can just directly extract that from cookies. So instead of doing this, we can just say reg.cookies.access token. Okay, so this is how we had to implement. So I was just following the older approach, so sorry for that. So we can just replace this with reg.cookies.access token, and we can just get rid of this. And also we had implemented that in the user controller for the refresh access token, where we get the access token. Again, we can just replace this whole thing with the reg.cookies.access token. Okay, and also we can get rid of this validator, which we no longer need, and also from the schema. Okay, so we can get rid of this auth, okay, and this thing. So I just made things very simple. Okay, so once we log in, the cookies are set. So now if I go to /api/todo and give it a send, so I will be able to get successful response. Okay, so now if I just remove the cookies, so that is set for the access token, and now try to send, so that should say token expired or invalid token. Okay, so that's the small change. Let's now continue with the video. So first of all, I'm just going to create a model to store all the particular roles that are required for this backend to do application. Okay, so I'm just going to the routes folder or the model folder and going to create a model just for the role. So I'm just going to call this role model. Sounds fancy, right? So inside this model, let's first of all create a schema. Okay, so I'm just going to call this schema, and this is going to initialize the new schema from Mongoose. So let's import that from Mongoose, and this is of course going to take in a object where the first particular property is going to be the code itself. Okay, so we can call this code. Okay, so basically the code will be admin or it can be user. Okay, so for this simple application, we are just going to consider two roles or two codes. One is the admin and the user. So before that, let us create an enum to store all those role codes, okay, inside that, so that we just don't misspell it anywhere. Okay, so that it will be just logged into one particular value. So let us also export it, called as enum, and this is going to be role code. And there are two codes basically we are going to use for this application. One is the user, and I'm going to set the value of that to again user, and then we have the admin. Alright, so let's give a comma here, and now let's assign that to a property within the schema called as code, and then this is going to be of type string, and this is of course going to be required. And then we have another property inside our schema called as enum. Okay, so we can just set basic enums just as we did like I guess for the user model or the to do, I guess. Yeah, we have the status, and we had set an enum for this. Okay, based on the to dos which are not started, in progress, and done. Okay, so the same implementation goes for role codes as well. So let's again get only the values by saying object.values and then pass in role codes. So this is basically only extracts the values and not the key values. Okay, so this is the first property, and the next one is going to be the status. Okay, so which is actually going to be true or false, basically if this code is even valid or not. So let's set status, and this is going to take in again the type, which is going to be of boolean. By default, set this to true. So once that's done, we can now set the timestamp. I'm gonna set that to true, and then we don't need the version key. Okay, so the __ v when for each document created in a MongoDB database. So I'm just going to set that to false, which we don't actually need. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create an interface, just as we have been doing for other models as well. So basically this interface, and then assign the type so that we get good TypeScript support. Okay, so let's again export interface, and I'm going to call this role, or let's call this role doc, since that's the convention which we have been following previously as well. So can just call this like so, and here the first thing is going to be the _id, which is going to be of types, which is the mongoose types dot object id, and then we have the code. So make sure there's no comma here inside interfaces. So code is going to be string, this is lowercase string, this which means that it is TypeScript, and this is status. Okay, so status, which is going to be of type boolean. So once we have done that, we can now assign that to our schema by passing it as a generic, so role code, and then finally we also need to define our document name, the schema, and the collection name. Okay, just as we have been doing for others as well. So I'm just going to copy this and we're going to rename the values. So this is, let's call this role, and the collection name we can call this roles. All right, so let's now go ahead and export this schema so that we can just play with the database. So before that, let us also set an index for this particular composite, so for the code and status. So basically when we want to retrieve the code along with the status, we will be retrieving those roles very fast. Okay, so currently it doesn't make sense because we just have two values, so our retrieval would be very fast in case if we have a long database. So I'm just going to stick to the same practice for every kind of model that we create. Okay, so that's why I'm just going to set schema.index, and also this is just for the sake of learning, right? So that will become a good practice for you all to set up indexes within MongoDB. So I'm just going to set code and then status and set that value to 1, which means that this will create a composite index between code and status. So once that's done, we can now go ahead and export our schema. So export const, I'm just going to call this role model, which sounds funny, and let's use the model from Mongoose. Alright, you just need to pass in the three things, that is the document name, collection name, and the schema. So make sure you follow this in order. So document name, then the schema, and finally the collection name. Alright, so let's also assign the type of this as role doc as generic to this model, and we have a error here, and sorry, I made a mistake here. This should be role doc and not role code. Okay, so that should fix it. So now let's go to the user model and create another property for this user called as roles. Okay, so what are all the roles that this particular user has? Okay, so we can just create another property right after this email, maybe called as roles. So this is going to be an array of values where each value is going to be like of type, which is going to be schema dot types dot object id, which means that it is a MongoDB object ID, and this is going to reference to some other table within our MongoDB database, right? So we just want to set the reference to that. So we are referencing the role model this particular schema. Okay, so we can just pass in ref, so like this, and then pass in the role. Okay, or in specific we can just import this particular document name so that we just don't make any mistake. So I'm just going to import the document name from our role model file, which is coming from role.model, and we can just give this an alias as role document name. Okay, so now we can just assign this over here. Okay, like this. Okay, so we have an error here, so we also need to add in the roles as well to this particular user doc, so which is roles and going to be of type role code. All right, so let's now and sorry, this should be an array of that. Okay, so now we're having another problem here, and sorry, this has to be types dot object id and not just a array of roles, because we are storing only the IDs of each role, right? So that's why it's giving an error. So types dot object id and yeah, that should fix it. And also make sure that for every reference you're giving, make sure you import that document name and not just hard code it to the exact value. Okay, so now let's go back to our to do routes. So this is the route which we want to protect, right? So just to the admin, so what we can just do is we can just list a particular array of all the roles that are actually required for this particular user to access this route. Okay, so for that we can just create a small helper function which will actually take in all the required roles and then store it within the request object, so that whenever we reach our authorization middleware, it will just compare the roles that are there within the user itself. So basically this role, so which are assigned to the user, and the roles that are required to access this particular route. Okay, so basically different routes might have different authorization roles to access that. So that is why we just want to create a helper function and then store whichever the user is trying to access that route. Okay, so let's go to the helpers and just create a file over there called role.ts, and in here let's export default a particular function which will take in all the role codes that are required to access that particular route. So export default function which will gonna take in an arbitrary amount of role codes. So I'm just going to use this spread operator, or we call this as a rest operator. Okay, and which is going to be of type role code, which we have within our model. So this is going to be an array of that. So now we just inside this function, let us now use this as a middleware using the request and the response and the next function. Okay, so let's also assign the types of that, so which is going to be of type request, which is coming from Express, and response and next function. Right, so now inside this function, now we have an array of the role codes that are passed into this function. So we have used the rest operator to store this within an array. So now we can just use that inside the request object by creating another property called current role codes, or you can just call this anything if you want. So current role codes, basically to access this particular route. So what are all the roles that we need? So current role codes, and I'm going to set that to the role codes, and finally called next. And of course we are going to get an error here because this property does not exist within our request object. So we just want to extend the default request that is coming from Express. Again, just as we did in the previous video, we go to the types file and then create another property just for the role. Okay, so I'm just going to do a declare interface called as role request. Okay, this is going to extend the default request, so basically this particular thing, and inside this we just want to add in the particular property that is current role codes over here, and which is going to be of type role codes, which is going to be an array of that. Okay, so like so, and now we can just replace this request with our role request. Okay, so now that error goes away. So let's go ahead and create a middleware for the authorization, which will actually compare the current role codes and then the user assigned role. Okay, so basically if I am the user who's assigned the type of where is that, so whatever that user have been assigned the type, so if that is there within this particular list of these role codes, then we allow the user to access that route. If not, we just terminate the request there itself. So let's now go to auth and create a middleware over there called as authorization, and in here we just want to do the same just as we did for the authentication. Okay, so first of all let's grab the Express router. So first I'm going to import Express from Express, and now let's extract the router. So export const router equals express.router, like so. So now let's export the middleware right away. So I'm just gonna export it default router.use. Okay, and this is going to of course take in the three parameters, that is request, response and next function. Okay, and also I'm gonna annotate the types for these. Alright, so inside this, the first thing which we want to check is the roles which is already assigned to the user, if that is even there. Okay, so that's the first level of check. So we check if the request.user, and if the request.user has a property called roles, so dot roles. If not, rec.user reg.user.roles, and one more thing which we want to check is the reg.current roles, just as we set over here. So current role codes, which I can just use this over here, and if that doesn't exist, then we just want to throw the error. Okay, so we just throw new bad request error by saying permission denied, or this should be a forbidden error, right? So forbidden error, and we have an error here because we need to use the role request. So we still see an error over here, user does not exist on type role request. So I just think I made a mistake, so this should not extend the actual request, so it should extend the protected request, so the previous one which we had just created. Okay, so protected request, and yeah, that error should go away. So let us wrap this entire thing inside a async handler, so that's why we are getting that error. So let us wrap this entire thing within the async handler. Okay, so basically to handle all the async requests, and then mark this function as async. Okay, so we have discussed about this in the last video, so that should get rid of all the errors. So now let's proceed ahead. So the first level of check is done, where the user should be having the property called roles and also the current role codes. If not, we just throw the error permission denied. Okay, so let's now check the exact roles that we are getting. So we can just store this in something like roles, and I'm just gonna call await and import the role model dot find. Okay, so we just want to find based on the current role codes that we are receiving over here. So inside this, we want to query based on the code, and then we check if that is there within the list that is passed in over here as current role codes. Okay, so we can just use the in operator, which is provided by MongoDB. So inside this, I can just provide $in and then pass in the codes. So basically this current role codes, so that is reg dot current role codes. Also I want to check if the status is true, so status, and set that to true. So once we get all the roles, we just want to check now that if the length of this is 0 or not. So if it is 0, which means that there is no role that the user has to access that route. Okay, so we can just check if the roles dot length, if that is a falsy value, or if it is an empty array. So we just want to throw new bad request error or forbidden error, so saying that permission denied. Alright, so once there is some roles within our roles array, so we just want to compare that with the actual roles that the user actually has. Okay, so we just can put inside a for loop, where we can just use the for of loop in order to compare between two arrays. Const, let's call this user role. Okay, so in order to distinguish within the current roles, and of reg.user.roles. Okay, so inside this, we just want to check if the current user role is there within this reg.current.roles. So if it is there, then we just return true. Okay, which means the user is authorized. So we can just create a flag over here, like we can just set let authorized. Okay, so initially is going to be false. Okay, later when any condition meets, we just gonna set this to true. Okay, so let's now check if that means we just want to break out of the loop. Okay, so if that is a truthy value, then we just want to break and then return it. Okay, so basically that we just don't want to check the rest, because if any one value matches the other value, then we just want to return true. Okay, and then allow the user to access that route. So now we just want to basically put in another for loop, because we are comparing two arrays, right? So we compare one element within the other array one by one. So we can just again use the for of loop. So we can just say const role of this roles over here, and now we check for this particular user role if that equal to the role. Okay, so basically we are only dealing with the MongoDB user IDs, because we have set the reference to that as the user ID. So now we check if the user role dot underscore id. So if we want to compare between two different MongoDB object IDs, so we can just use the equals function and then pass in the exactly this dot id. Okay, so this role dot id, if this is true, then we just want to set the authorized flag to true. Okay, and then we just want to break out of the function. So now we finally check if this flag is true or false. Based on that, we throw the error, or call next function from the middleware. So let's put a check over here. If the authorized flag is true or false. So if not authorized, then we just want to throw new forbidden error saying that permission denied. Alright, so once if the authorized flag is true, so basically the control will reach over here, and we just want to call next, okay, by just returning next. Alright, so that is it for this particular authorization middleware. Okay, so we just now gotta use this. Okay, so we can just go to the to do routes, okay, over here, and then pass this as a middleware right before this get to do's function. So now right before we call this get to do's controller, when we make a get request, okay, so we have already created this particular roles thing, okay, so which will actually create a property within the request object with the actual roles that are required to access this particular route. So we can just utilize this. So I'm just going to import that role thing, okay, so which is going to come from helpers/role, okay, and then inside this we need to pass in those roles, right? So let's first import the role code enum, and then we can pass in the admin. Okay, so only the admin should be able to access this particular route. So we are getting an error over here, and of course this has to be role request. Okay, so we are given this role request, but so I just try to get some help. So basically we just need to specifically mark this request as role request like this. Okay, so I'm just gonna copy this and replace this with that. Okay, so the only change is that we are just marking this request as the request object itself from Express, but now we are marking this request object specifically to this role request. Okay, and then using this particular variable name itself. So that should fix the error. So once that's done, now we can now pass in the authorization middleware, which we can auto import, and passing it right after that. Okay, so it will just go through this sequence. So first it checks if it has an API key, or okay, so if it has the necessary permissions to access any routes. Okay, and then it makes a authentication. Basically the user needs to be logged in, and then the user must be an admin for that, so which will basically store the rec.current user roles within the request object, and based on that it will go to this authorization middleware, and over there it will compare the current roles that is set by that previous middleware, and then once all of these checks pass, it will be able to reach this particular controller to get all the to-dos. Okay, so user will be able to get all the to-dos. So before we test this out, we need to make some few changes. Okay, so before the user registers, we also need to assign the role to the particular user, and the role will actually be by default as a normal user. Okay, and later any admin can come and change the role of the user to maybe admin later in the future maybe. So that is why we need to do that setup before we test. So for that, let's go to the user controller, and let's go to the register user controller, and over here we just need to also pass in the roles over here whenever we create a user. Okay, so we receive the name, email and password, and make sure that we don't extract the roles over here, because the user itself doesn't have to provide the roles. So by default we are setting that as to be user. So now we just need to also pass in roles. So inside this we need to pass in the role ID. Okay, so basically we have a role model, right, where each of this code and status will be assigned to a particular MongoDB ID which is stored. So we just want to assign that ID. So based on that ID, will be linking the particular user to this role. Okay, so that's why we have given this type of schema.object ID, and the reference is going to be the particular role model. So that is why we need to pass in an object ID and not just role. Okay, so we just want to get the particular ID for that user role. So for that, let us go ahead and create a controller to fetch the ID of the user role. Okay, so I have already created a particular file over here which is empty for now, called as role controller, and over here we can just create an async function to, let's call this get role. Okay, and which is going to of course receive the role itself. So this role will be of the type role code, which we can import from the role model file. Okay, and which is just going to receive one value and not multiple values. Okay, so based on that we are going to fetch the role and return the ID. Okay, so this ID which we are going to use over here, and create the role for the user whenever the user registers. Okay, so that's just a brief, and this is just going to return a promise. Okay, and which is going to be of like type MongoDB object ID. So I can just import types from MongoDB and mongoose and dot object ID. So that's what it's going to return. So it can also either return this or null if it doesn't find. Okay, so inside this we just want to now just use a try catch. So we just need to fetch the particular role. So I'm just going to store this within user role, and this is going to be await role model, which I'm going to auto import dot find one. Okay, so here we just need to pass in the code itself. Okay, so this role over here, so where the code is going to be of this role, and of course the status has to be true. Okay, so once we find the user role, so we just want to check if we actually find the user role. So if not user role, then we just want to throw new internal server error. So internal error saying that user not found. Okay, so once that's done, we now return the user dot underscore id, because that's what we need to pass in inside that roles array. Okay, so just return user role dot underscore id. So that's it. So inside this catch we just want to throw again this the same internal server error if there is any error. Okay, so let's also console log the error if we want to debug anything. Let's finally export this function. So once that's done, we can now go back to the user controller, and within this roles array we can now use the get role function, which is which will actually return a promise, right? So we can use await get role, which I'm going to auto import and then pass in the particular role. Okay, so that's what it expects over here, that is of type role code. So I'm just going to import role code like this. Okay, so once that's done, we now need to create a particular record, right, within our role table that we just created a model for. So basically this table is currently empty, so we just need to seed some data. Okay, so if you want, you can also create a seeder file. So since we just have two particular roles over here, I'm just going to directly import that from MongoDB Compass. Okay, so we can go to MongoDB Compass, and I have just currently logged into my database. So we can go to the roles table, and as you see, currently we do not have any role. Okay, so you can just click on add data and click on insert document. So this will go ahead and insert a document, and over here you can just click on edit and just add in some properties or columns over here. So we can just set a first property called as code, and for here I'm gonna use user. Okay, so which is all caps. Okay, so that's what we set inside enums, and also another property that is for the status. Okay, because these are the two properties which we defined for this particular table, and the status is going to be of type boolean. So you can just change this type from string to a boolean and change this to true. Okay, so let's click on update. So we have successfully created a particular role over here which is of type user. Okay, so if you want, you can also create another one for admin. So I'm just going to test with this particular one. Okay, so now we can just go ahead and register a particular user. While creating the user, it will check what all the roles it has for the code user, and it will just grab this object ID and store it to the user as a entry for the roles array inside the user. Okay, so now we can just go ahead and register a particular user. So currently I have no users, so I'll just register one. So now let's go to Postman, and I am at the route of /API/user/register, which is a post request. So within the body I have just passed in just the test name and email password. Okay, so now if I just click on send, so that will register a particular user. Okay, so the main thing which we now need to see is go back to our MongoDB Compass, and now here if we refresh, so we should find a record for the test user, and you see that we have a roles array which is of the type object ID, and this is the object ID which we have assigned the role for. Okay, so it ends with 9551, and if we go back to the roles, and that also ends with 9551. Okay, so the user role is referencing the roles table over here, which is linked to the user record. So now let's go ahead and try to access the get to do routes. Okay, so currently within our code, if we go to the to do routes, we have applied the authorization middleware over here, and to access this particular route, the user has to be an admin. Okay, so currently the role of the user is a normal user, so we should be getting a error over here saying that permission denied. So right over here, so if the authorized flag is not true, then we just get this error permission denied. Okay, so let's go ahead and test that. So I'm just going to the API slash to do route over here, and within the body I have just passed in the email, okay, the exact email that I just registered the user for, and then the password. And also remember, in the last video we also need to pass in the access token. So now let's click on send. So now we get an internal server error. So the reason for the error is when I check the terminal where I have applied the console log for the current user role codes and then the user roles. Okay, so here the current role codes is just a string, array of string called admin. Okay, but the user roles is an object ID, array of object IDs. So that is why we are getting that error, because it's not able to compare these two things. Okay, so we just need to modify this logic slightly better. Okay, sorry for this. So first let's extract all the IDs that we have for this roles array. Okay, so that we just compare that one by one. So I'm just going to call this role IDs. Okay, and I'm just going to map across all the roles by roles.map, and for every role we just want to just get the ID of that. So role._id, and we just want to convert that to a plain string. Okay, not a MongoDB string, so we say .toString. Okay, so now we have a array of role IDs. So inside this particular for loop, so we just want to delete this particular thing which is no longer valid. So now we just want to put in another if check and check if the role IDs, which is an array which we can use the includes method on it, and for every record inside that, so basically we can just call this user role. So basically this user role will be still of MongoDB object ID. So let's convert that back to a string and then compare it. So once we do this, so inside this if check we just want to put the authorized flag to true. Okay, so currently it will be false, now it is true once there is a match. Okay, and then we just want to break. Okay, and one more mistake I made is this status. Okay, which should come outside because the status belongs to the role and not to the code. Okay, so once I save this, so we can now go ahead and test this out. So I'm going back to Postman. So now if I just click on send, so now I get a permission denied response. Okay, which means that I am currently logged in as a normal user, and this requires the role of admin to access this route. Okay, so now if I go back to my MongoDB database and then manually just go ahead and change this to admin and click on update. So now if I just go back and click on send, I should be able to access my to-dos. Okay, because now I am an admin. Okay, so this is all about user authorization. So currently we are undergoing various levels of authentication and authorization. So first is checking the API key, which we actually need to provide. So if we go to the headers, we are actually passing in the API key and also with the necessary permissions, and then it goes to the next middleware, that is to have the necessary permissions from the API key to access these particular routes that are defined. So that we have already spoken in the previous video, and then the user needs to be logged in. Basically we are used the authentication by using access tokens and refresh tokens, which we had discussed in the last video. And then we have another middleware, that is to have certain access roles for every route that we define over here. So currently we have implemented for the get to do's route. So the user has to be an admin in order to access these routes. We have currently seen that. Okay, so this is basically a very strong authentication and authorization strategy which actually protects our backend API routes. Okay, and not exposing them to anyone, and also make it restricted to certain people with exact roles that the user has been assigned for. Okay, so this is all about the video for authorization. Okay, so if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. So I hope you like this video. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video if you liked it. So thank you so much. I will see you guys